The desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its golden sands shimmering like molten metal in the afternoon heat. Sister Margaret had been walking for 3 days now, her black habit heavy with dust and sweat, her water nearly gone. She had left the mission in Santa Fe under circumstances that still burned in her memory like a brand. Accusations whispered in dark corridors. Fingers pointed at her unorthodox methods of ministering to the Apache people who came seeking food and medicine. The wind carried only silence, and the distant cry of vultures circling overhead. It was then, cresting a small rise between two weathered mesas, that she saw him, a young Apache man, buried up to his neck in the sand, his bronze skin already blistered and raw from hours under the punishing sun. Beside him, a crude wooden sign had been driven into the earth, its message carved in rough English letters, "Let the sun finish what we started." Sister Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The young man's eyes, though swollen and inflamed from the heat, fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her very soul. He did not cry out for help, did not beg for mercy. Instead, he watched her with the stoic dignity of his people, as if life and death were merely choices to be made in the silence of the desert. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this story, and please let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything to us as we bring these tales of the Old West to life. The nun's hand instinctively moved to the wooden cross hanging from her neck, her fingers tracing its familiar edges as her mind raced. Her faith commanded her to extend a helping hand to all of God's children, regardless of their race or creed. But the harsh reality of frontier life whispered warnings in her ear. Helping this Apache warrior could bring the wrath of both his enemies and the white settlers who had done this terrible thing. She had seen what happened to those who crossed the unwritten laws of the territory. The desert was littered with the bones of men and women who had chosen compassion over caution. Yet as she stared into the young man's eyes, she saw something that shook her to her core. Not hatred or anger, but a profound acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. The vultures circled lower now, their shadows dancing across the sand like harbingers of death. Sister Margaret knew that time was running short. The sun was at its peak, and even a strong man could not survive much longer in such conditions. She looked around the desolate landscape, seeing no signs of the men who had committed this atrocity, but knowing they could return at any moment. Her water skin felt heavy at her side, a reminder of her own precarious situation. She was still days from the nearest settlement, and sharing her meager supply could mean death for them both. Yet something in the young Apache's gaze spoke to a deeper truth, that in this moment, in this vast and unforgiving wilderness, they were simply two human souls facing the ultimate test of what it meant to be alive. The wind picked up, sending small whirlwinds of sand dancing across the desert floor. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, asking for guidance in this moment that would define not only the fate of the buried warrior, but the very essence of who she was meant to be in this harsh and beautiful land, where the law of men always bowed to the law of the earth itself. Sister Margaret's decision came not as a thunderbolt of divine inspiration, but as a quiet certainty that settled in her heart like morning dew on desert stone. She dropped to her knees beside the buried Apache, her hands already working to scoop away the burning sand that imprisoned him. The young man's eyes widened slightly, perhaps the first sign of surprise he had shown since her arrival. "What is your name?" she asked in the broken Apache she had learned during her time at the mission. The words felt clumsy on her tongue, but she saw understanding flicker in his dark eyes. "Nalnish," he replied, his voice barely a whisper, cracked from thirst and exposure. "It means, he who works." As Sister Margaret dug, she told him her story, how she had come to the Southwest as a young woman, filled with dreams of bringing God's word to the frontier, how she had learned that faith meant more than reciting prayers. It meant seeing the divine spark in every person, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke, how her superiors had grown uncomfortable with her methods, her willingness to treat Apache patients alongside white settlers, her insistence that God's love knew no boundaries. The sand was hot enough to burn her hands through her thin gloves, but she continued digging. Nalnish watched her work, and slowly, carefully, began to tell his own story. He had been hunting alone when a group of cavalry soldiers found him. They accused him of stealing cattle, though he had taken nothing. When he tried to explain, they decided to make an example of him. "They said the desert would be my judge," Nalnish said. his voice growing stronger as more of his body was freed from the sand. They said if their God wanted me to live, he would send someone to save me. Sister Margaret paused in her digging, struck by the profound irony of his words. And what do you think? She asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Nalnish's cracked lips. I think your God and mine might be the same, just wearing different faces. As the afternoon wore on, Sister Margaret managed to free Nalnish's arms and torso. She gave him small sips of water, knowing she had to ration their supply carefully. The young Apache's strength began to return, and he was able to help dig himself out of the remaining sand that trapped his legs. When he finally stood free, Nalnish was unsteady on his feet, but his dignity remained intact. He looked at the crude sign that had marked his intended grave, then at the nun who had risked everything to save him. Without a word, he pulled the sign from the ground and broke it across his knee, scattering the pieces to the desert wind. Where will you go? Sister Margaret asked, knowing that both of them were now fugitives in their own ways. Nalnish pointed toward a distant mountain range, purple in the afternoon haze. My people have a hidden camp there. Both of us could find safety there if you wish. The nun looked back toward the direction she had come, toward the world of missions and settlements where her presence was no longer welcome. Then she looked toward the mountains, toward an uncertain future with people she barely knew but who might understand what it meant to be outcasts in their own land. Lead the way, she said simply. As they began their journey across the desert, walking side by side, Sister Margaret realized that she had found something she had been searching for without knowing it, a purpose that transcended the boundaries of race and religion, a calling that existed in the space between worlds where only truth and compassion mattered. The journey to the Apache camp took 3 days, during which Sister Margaret and Nalnish traveled mostly at night to avoid the brutal desert heat and the patrols that might be searching for them. During the cool hours before dawn, they shared stories that bridged the gap between their vastly different worlds. Nalnish told her about his childhood, learning to track deer through mountain forests and to read the language of clouds and wind. He spoke of his grandmother, a medicine woman who taught him that healing came not just from herbs and rituals, but from understanding the connections between all living things. Sister Margaret found herself thinking of her own grandmother, an Irish immigrant who had whispered old prayers in Gaelic and insisted that God spoke through the voices of the poor and forgotten. On the second night, as they sheltered in a small cave, Nalnish asked Sister Margaret why she had really left the mission. The official story, that she had requested a transfer to minister to isolated settlements, was clearly not the whole truth. Sister Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead through the cave opening. Finally she spoke. There was a young Apache girl, maybe 12 years old, who came to the mission with a terrible fever. The other sisters wanted to turn her away, said it was too dangerous to treat her. I couldn't do that. I brought her inside, cared for her in secret. Did she live? Nalnish asked softly. Yes, she lived. But when the mission board found out, they said I had violated protocol, endangered the other patients. They gave me a choice: accept reassignment to a remote outpost or face formal censure. Sister Margaret's voice grew bitter. They spoke of Christian charity in their sermons, but when it came time to practice it, Nalnish nodded, understanding. My people have a saying, the loudest thunder often brings the least rain. On the third day, they reached the foothills of the mountains Nalnish had pointed toward. The landscape changed dramatically. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient cathedrals, and hidden springs created small oases of green in the otherwise barren terrain. It was here that they encountered the first Apache scouts. Sister Margaret's heart raced as 3 warriors emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, their faces painted for war, rifles held ready. But Nalnish stepped forward and spoke rapidly in his native language, gesturing toward the nun. The lead scout, an older man with silver streaking his black hair, listened intently, his eyes never leaving Sister Margaret's face. After what felt like an eternity, the scout nodded and replied to Nalnish. Then, to Sister Margaret's surprise, he addressed her directly in accented but clear English. Nalnish tells us you saved his life, that you risked your own safety to free him from the white man's justice. He says you are a holy woman who sees beyond the color of skin. The scout's weathered face was unreadable. I am Cochise's brother Coyotero. If what Nalnish says is true, you are welcome in our camp. But know this, once you enter, you become one of us. There is no going back to your old life. Sister Margaret looked at Nalnish, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then back at Coyotero, she thought of the mission she had left behind, the comfortable certainty of her former life, the approval of her superiors that she would never again receive. Then she thought of the young Apache girl whose life she had saved, of Nalnish buried in the sand, of all the people who needed healing but were turned away because they didn't fit into neat categories of worthy and unworthy. "I understand," she said firmly. "Lead me to your people." The Apache camp was hidden in a box canyon, invisible from the surrounding desert, but protected by high walls of red stone. As Sister Margaret followed Nalnish and the scouts through a narrow passage between towering cliffs, she felt as though she was entering another world entirely. The camp itself was larger than she had expected, with perhaps 200 people living in traditional wickiups scattered throughout the canyon floor. Children played in the shade of cottonwood trees that grew near a clear stream, while women worked at grinding corn and weaving baskets. Men sat in circles, some crafting weapons and tools, others engaged in animated discussions. When the small group emerged into the camp proper, a hush fell over the activities. All eyes turned toward Sister Margaret, taking in her black habit, her pale skin, her obvious foreignness. She felt the weight of their scrutiny but forced herself to walk with dignity, remembering that she was a guest here and that her very presence might be seen as a threat. Nalnish led her to the largest wickiup, where an elderly woman sat grinding seeds with a stone matat. Her hair was white as snow, braided with colorful beads, and her face bore the deep lines of someone who had seen many seasons pass. When she looked up at Sister Margaret, her eyes held a wisdom that seemed to span centuries. "Grandmother," Nalnish said respectfully, "this is the holy woman I told you about. She freed me from the sand grave and shared her water when she had little to spare." The old woman studied Sister Margaret for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit. In halting English mixed with Apache words, she began to speak. "I am Lozen's aunt, keeper of the old ways. Nalnish has told me of your kindness, but I must know, why did you help him? Your people and mine have been enemies for many seasons." Sister Margaret chose her words carefully. "Because I believe that all people are children of the same Creator, regardless of what name they use to call upon him. Because I have seen too much suffering that could be prevented if we simply chose to see each other as human beings first." The old woman nodded slowly. "You speak truth, but truth alone will not keep you safe here. There are those among my people who have lost children to your soldiers, who have seen their homes burned and their sacred places defiled. They will not welcome you easily." "I understand," Sister Margaret replied. "I ask only for the chance to prove that not all of my people are enemies. I have skills as a healer. Perhaps I can be useful." It was then that a commotion arose from another part of the camp. A young mother came running, carrying a small child who was clearly very ill. The boy, perhaps 4 years old, was burning with fever and struggling to breathe. The woman spoke rapidly to the old woman in Apache, tears streaming down her face. Without hesitation, Sister Margaret rose and approached the mother and child. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the boy. The mother looked uncertain, but the old woman nodded permission. Sister Margaret gently examined the child, feeling his forehead, listening to his labored breathing, checking his throat. She recognized the symptoms immediately. It was the same fever that had nearly killed the Apache girl at the mission months ago. "I can help him," she said quietly, "but I will need certain herbs and someone who knows where to find them in this country." The old woman's eyes sharpened with interest. "What do you need?" As Sister Margaret listed the plants she required, she saw recognition dawn in the old woman's face. These were remedies that bridged 2 worlds of healing knowledge: European medical training combined with indigenous wisdom about local plants and their properties. "Nalnish," the old woman said, "take her to gather what she needs. If she can save this child, she will have proven her worth to our people." As they prepared to leave the camp in search of medicinal plants, Sister Margaret realized that this moment would determine not just whether she would be accepted by the Apache, but whether she could truly become the healer she had always dreamed of being, one who served all people, regardless of the boundaries that others tried to impose. The search for medicinal plants led Sister Margaret and Nalnish deep into the canyon's hidden recesses, where ancient springs fed secret gardens of healing herbs. As they worked together, gathering willow bark for the fever and wild mint to ease the child's breathing, Sister Margaret felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her like a benediction. The old woman, whose name she learned was Dante, proved to be a master healer in her own right. Together, They prepared a treatment that combined Sister Margaret's knowledge of European medicine with Dante's deep understanding of desert plants and their properties. As they worked side by side, grinding herbs and brewing teas, language barriers seemed to dissolve, replaced by the universal language of healing. The sick child, whose name was Little Wolf, responded to their treatment within hours. His fever broke during the night, and by morning he was sitting up and asking for food. Word of the healing spread quickly through the camp, and Sister Margaret found that the suspicious glances had been replaced by cautious respect. But it was not just the successful treatment that won over the Apache people. It was the way Sister Margaret had worked alongside Dante as an equal, listening more than she spoke, learning rather than trying to impose her own methods. She showed genuine reverence for their healing traditions, asking questions about the spiritual aspects of their medicine, and sharing her own understanding of how faith and healing intertwined. Over the following weeks, Sister Margaret found herself becoming an integral part of the camp's daily life. She learned to speak Apache with increasing fluency, helped tend the sick and injured, and even began to understand the complex social structures that governed the community. She discovered that the Apache people had their own rich spiritual traditions, their own ways of connecting with the divine that were no less valid than her own Christian faith. One evening, as she sat by the fire with Dante and several other women, the old healer asked her a question that cut to the heart of her transformation. "Sister Margaret," Dante said, using the Apache pronunciation that had become her name in the camp, "you came to us as a woman of your God, but you have learned our ways, shared our struggles. What are you now?" Sister Margaret considered the question carefully. She thought of the mission she had left behind, with its rigid rules and narrow definitions of who deserved God's love. She thought of the young Apache girl she had saved, of Nalnish buried in the sand, of Little Wolf's fever breaking in the night. She thought of all the healing that had happened not because of religious doctrine, but because of simple human compassion. "I am still a woman of God," she said finally, "but I have learned that God has many faces, speaks many languages, and works through many hands. I am a healer, a bridge between worlds, a servant of all people who suffer." Dante smiled, her weathered face creasing with approval. "Then you have found your true calling, Sister Margaret. You are no longer just a white woman or just a Christian. You are something new, a person who belongs to all peoples and to none, who serves the Great Spirit by serving his children, whatever name they call him." As the months passed, Sister Margaret's reputation as a healer spread beyond the Apache camp. People from other tribes began to seek her out, and even some white settlers, desperate for medical help in the remote desert, overcame their prejudices to ask for her assistance. She treated them all with equal compassion, never asking about their race or religion, only about their need for healing. The transformation was not without its challenges. There were those among both the Apache and the white settlers who viewed her with suspicion, seeing her as a traitor to her own people or as a dangerous influence on traditional ways. But Sister Margaret had found something more valuable than acceptance. She had found her true purpose. One day, nearly a year after she had first found Nalnish buried in the sand, a messenger arrived at the camp with news that would test everything she had learned. A group of Apache warriors had been captured by the cavalry and were being held at Fort Bowie, awaiting execution. Among them was Nalnish's younger brother, barely 16 years old. The camp erupted in anguished discussion. Some called for a rescue attempt, others for negotiation, still others for revenge. But it was Dante who proposed the most radical solution. "Sister Margaret," she said, "you are known to both peoples now. You could go to this fort, speak to their leaders. Perhaps they would listen to you in a way they would never listen to us." Sister Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She knew that attempting to negotiate with the military would be dangerous. She could be arrested as a deserter or worse. But she also knew that she could not stand by and watch innocent people die when she might have the power to prevent it. "I will go," she said simply, "but I will need help getting there safely." Nalnish stepped forward immediately. "I will guide you. It is my brother's life at stake." As they prepared for the dangerous journey to Fort Bowie, Sister Margaret realized that this would be the ultimate test of everything she had learned about bridging worlds, about finding common ground between enemies, about the power of compassion to overcome hatred and fear. The journey to Fort Bowie took 5 days of hard riding across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the Southwest. Sister Margaret and Nalnish traveled with a small group of Apache warriors who would remain hidden in the hills while she attempted to negotiate with the fort's commander. As they rode, Sister Margaret found herself praying not just for success, but for the wisdom to find the right words to touch the hearts of men who had been hardened by years of frontier warfare. Fort Bowie sat like a brown scar on the desert landscape, its adobe walls and wooden watchtowers stark against the endless blue sky. As Sister Margaret approached the main gate, she could see soldiers scrambling to alert their superiors to the unexpected arrival of a nun in the company of Apache guides. Colonel James Morrison, the fort's commander, was a weathered man in his 50s whose gray beard and tired eyes spoke of too many years fighting a war that seemed to have no end. When Sister Margaret was escorted into his office, he looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Sister Margaret O'Brien," he said, reading from a report on his desk. "Formerly of the Santa Fe mission, currently listed as missing and presumed dead. Yet here you are, arriving in the company of Apache warriors. I confess myself puzzled." Sister Margaret had prepared for this moment during the long ride to the fort. She knew that her credibility would depend on absolute honesty about her circumstances, even if it put her at risk. "Colonel Morrison," she began, "I am here to speak for the Apache prisoners you are holding. I know that may seem strange given my background, but I have spent the past year living among these people, learning their ways, serving as a healer to their community. I have come to understand that they are not the savages they have been portrayed as, but human beings with families, hopes, and fears just like our own." The colonel's expression hardened. "Sister, these men are warriors who have killed soldiers under my command. They have raided settlements, stolen cattle, terrorized innocent civilians. The law demands justice." "And what of the young boy among them?" Sister Margaret asked quietly. "Nalnish's brother, who is barely 16 years old? What crime has he committed that deserves death?" Colonel Morrison was silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "He was found with the raiding party. Under military law, that makes him complicit in their crimes." Sister Margaret leaned forward, her voice passionate but controlled. "Colonel, I have seen what happens when we allow hatred and fear to guide our actions. I have seen the cycle of violence that destroys both Apache and white families alike. But I have also seen something else. The possibility of healing, of understanding, of finding a different way forward." She told him about Little Wolf, the sick child she had helped heal. She spoke of Dante and the other Apache women who had welcomed her despite having every reason to hate white people. She described the complex society she had discovered, with its own laws, its own sense of justice, its own deep spirituality. "These people are not monsters, Colonel. They are fighting for their homeland, for their way of life, for the survival of their children. Can you honestly say that if foreign invaders came to your land, you would not fight just as fiercely?" Colonel Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desert that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with weariness. "Sister, I have been fighting this war for 15 years. I have seen good men die on both sides, seen atrocities committed by Apache and white alike. I understand your compassion, but I also understand my duty. These men will be executed at dawn tomorrow, as ordered by my superiors." Sister Margaret felt despair rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Then let me make you a different proposal. Allow me to take the boy, Nalnish's brother, back to the Apache camp. He is young enough to learn a different way, to perhaps become a bridge between our peoples as I have tried to become. In exchange, I will remain here as your prisoner, to face whatever charges you deem appropriate." The colonel turned back to her, his eyes widening in surprise. "You would sacrifice yourself for an Apache boy you barely know?" "I would sacrifice myself for the possibility of peace," Sister Margaret replied. "For the chance that one young life might grow up to help heal the wounds between our peoples instead of deepening them." Colonel Morrison stared at her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision that went against everything his military training had taught him. Finally he spoke. "I cannot release the boy without authorization from my superiors. But I can delay the execution for 24 hours while I send a telegram to headquarters, explaining the unusual circumstances. If you are willing to remain here as my guest during that time, perhaps we can find a solution that serves both justice and mercy." Sister Margaret nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Colonel. That is all I ask. A chance for wisdom to prevail over vengeance." As she was escorted to quarters within the fort, Sister Margaret sent up a prayer that the seeds of compassion she had tried to plant would find fertile ground in the hearts of men who had the power to choose between perpetuating the cycle of violence or beginning the long, difficult work of peace. The 24 hours that followed were among the longest of Sister Margaret's life. She spent them in a small room within the fort, praying, writing letters to the Apache camp, and preparing herself for whatever fate awaited her. Through her window she could see the guardhouse where the Apache prisoners were being held, and her heart ached for the fear and despair they must be feeling. Late that evening, Colonel Morrison came to see her. His face was grave, but she detected something else in his expression, perhaps a glimmer of hope. "I have received a response from my superiors," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "They are intrigued by your proposal, but they have conditions." Sister Margaret leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "They will consider releasing the boy into your custody, but only if the Apache leaders agree to enter into formal peace negotiations. Real negotiations, sister, not the empty promises we have heard before. They want a guarantee that the raiding will stop, that there will be a genuine effort to find a peaceful solution to this conflict. And if the Apache refuse?" Sister Margaret asked. "Then the executions will proceed as scheduled, and you will be charged with desertion and aiding the enemy." The colonel's voice was heavy with regret. "I am sorry, sister, but those are the terms." Sister Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an entire people's future resting on her shoulders. She knew that convincing the Apache leaders to trust in peace negotiations would be nearly impossible. They had been betrayed too many times before. But she also knew that this might be the only chance to break the cycle of violence that was destroying both peoples. "I need to speak with Nalnish," she said finally. "He is waiting in the hills with the others. If anyone can convince the Apache leaders to consider this proposal, it will be him." Colonel Morrison nodded. "I will allow you to meet with him under a flag of truce. But sister, you must understand, if this fails, if the Apache reject our offer, there will be nothing more I can do." The meeting took place at dawn, in a small valley between the fort and the hills where the Apache warriors waited. Sister Margaret rode out with a small escort of soldiers, her heart pounding with the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Nalnish emerged from the rocks like a ghost, his face painted for war, but his eyes filled with desperate hope. When Sister Margaret explained the colonel's proposal, she saw him struggle with emotions too complex for words. "You ask me to trust the word of soldiers who have broken every promise they have ever made to my people," he said finally. "You ask me to convince my leaders to walk into what may be a trap. I ask you to trust in the possibility that there is another way." Sister Margaret replied, "I ask you to believe that your brother's life, and the lives of countless others, are worth the risk of hoping for peace." Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant fort where his brother waited for death. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I will carry your words to my people, but Sister Margaret, if this is a betrayal, if my brother dies because I convinced our leaders to trust in white man's promises, I will never forgive myself." "Then we must make sure it is not a betrayal," Sister Margaret said firmly. "We must make sure that this time the promises are kept." As Nalnish rode back toward the Apache camp, Sister Margaret returned to the fort to wait. She knew that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of the prisoners, but the future of an entire region that had been torn apart by war for too long. The answer came as the sun reached its zenith. A small group of Apache riders appeared on the horizon, approaching the fort under a white flag. At their head rode Cochise himself, the legendary leader whose very name struck fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. Sister Margaret watched from the fort's walls as the Apache delegation approached. Cochise was an imposing figure, tall and dignified, his presence commanding respect even from his enemies. Beside him rode Nalnish and several other warriors, their faces set with grim determination. The negotiations that followed were tense and difficult. Cochise spoke through an interpreter, his words carefully chosen, his demands clear. He would consider a ceasefire and formal peace talks, but only if certain conditions were met: the immediate release of all Apache prisoners, not just the boy, the establishment of a reservation where his people could live according to their traditional ways, and guarantees that white settlers would not encroach on Apache lands. Colonel Morrison listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, his military bearing never wavering even as he negotiated with a man he had been trying to capture for years. Sister Margaret found herself serving as an unofficial mediator, her unique position allowing her to speak to both sides with credibility. The breakthrough came when Cochise asked to speak with Sister Margaret privately. Through the interpreter, he said, "This white woman has lived among my people. She has healed our children, shared our struggles. I would hear her words about whether these soldiers can be trusted." Sister Margaret chose her words carefully, knowing that lives hung in the balance. "Great Chief," she said, "I cannot promise that all white men will keep their word, just as you cannot promise that all Apache will lay down their weapons. But I can tell you that Colonel Morrison is a man of honor who is tired of war, just as you are. I believe that if we take this first step together, we can begin to build the trust that will make lasting peace possible." Cochise studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have proven yourself a friend to my people, Sister Margaret. If you believe this man speaks truth, then I will take the risk of believing also." The agreement that was reached that day was not perfect. It was a fragile beginning rather than a final solution. But it was enough. The Apache prisoners were released, including Nalnish's young brother, who ran into his sibling's arms with tears streaming down his face. A formal ceasefire was declared, and plans were made for more comprehensive peace negotiations to be held in the coming months. As Sister Margaret watched the Apache delegation ride away from Fort Bowie, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with humility. She had not single-handedly ended the Apache wars. That would take years more of patient work by many people on both sides. But she had helped plant the seeds of peace in ground that had been watered with too much blood for too long. Colonel Morrison approached her as she stood on the fort's walls, watching the riders disappear into the desert haze. "Sister," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened here today will be remembered. You have shown us all that there is another way, that courage and compassion can triumph over hatred and fear." Sister Margaret smiled, feeling the desert wind on her face and the warmth of the sun on her shoulders. "Colonel, I have learned that healing, whether of bodies or of hearts, requires patience, faith, and the willingness to see the humanity in everyone we meet. Today, we all chose to see each other as human beings first. That is the real victory." As the months that followed would prove, the peace negotiations were indeed successful. The Apache wars in that region came to an end not through military conquest, but through the patient work of building understanding between former enemies. Sister Margaret continued to serve as a bridge between the two communities, establishing a clinic that served both Apache and white patients, and training others in the art of healing that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Years later, when historians would write about the end of the Apache Wars, they would note the role played by an unlikely nun who had found her calling not in the comfortable certainty of a mission, but in the harsh beauty of the desert, where she learned that God's love was as vast and boundless as the sky itself, embracing all peoples under its infinite expanse. The story of Sister Margaret and Nalnish became legend in the Southwest, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of compassion to overcome hatred, of understanding to bridge the deepest divides, and of faith to transform even the most hardened hearts. In the end, it was not the law of men that prevailed in that harsh and beautiful land, but the higher law of love that recognizes no boundaries and claims all of humanity as its own.